All together now. Oh, go ahead.
No introduction. He's a man who needs no introduction. Join me in welcoming Jeff Dolven.
All right, thank you, everyone. All together now, the name of the talk, this title is in a different font than I chose, so who knows what other derangements await. But let's see. Ready? Let's begin with a brief attentional exercise. Are you doing it yet, the attentional exercise? What syllable are you seeking, vocalissimus, in the distances of sleep? Speak it. How many S's in this poem? How many S's in this poem? How many S's in this poem? By one count, 8. By another count, only 1, repeated several times, but all thought together, all thought at once. Or else, how could we know that there were 8 of them? 8 of them now. Right? So the susurrations of Wallace Stevens to the roaring wind are the sound of the wind in the poem's words. And there it is. A wind that can shape a syllable, that can start or finish a syllable, but can never fill it. That most vocal one, vocalissimus, the wind has no vowel, only the consonant, the S, and the poem is a kind of a taunt addressed by an articulate speaker to the mere moving air that the speaker speaks with. To hear the poem or to read it is to listen to those S's go by serially and get a sense that they want consideration, that they want some kind of thinking together, some attention paid to all of them. And what I want to suggest this afternoon, it's a fairly simple proposition, is just that togetherness, that consideration, might be understood and even experienced as simultaneity, all the S's at once. And that from that simultaneity, we can derive a definition of poetry itself as a kind of language that most wants to be self-simultaneous, that most wants to happen at the same time. Language that is at once a limit object and effect of attention. So, there's a problem here traditional to the phenomenology of attention, whether it's possible to pay attention to more than one thing at a time, and if so, what kind of attention that could be and how it could work. And it's a problem that arises, and I think over the course of these proceedings, as I understand it, has arisen before in terms of distraction, concentration, multitasking, all the experiences of divided attention. Sometimes, however, this question is thought of as really the question at the bottom of all attention, paying attention to more than one thing at once, particularly by cognitive scientists who hold feature integration theories, theories that attempt to explain what they call the binding problem. The binding problem, given that features of experience such as shape and color are processed by different systems in the brain, as they are, how is it that these features are bound to particular objects in ways that allow us to unify what it's useful to unify and separate what it is useful to separate? That is, from the sensory input, which is processed by different systems in the brain, how do we make one object? How do we bind all those qualities into one object? Hold together objects, hold together people, hold together works of art. Given a bolt of lightning in a stormy sky, how do we experience the blinding white light, the jagged shape, and the clap of thunder as aspects of a single phenomenon? One way is to define attention precisely as the act of binding, within which what Deborah Treisman has influentially described as a window of focus that accomplishes this unification wherever it's directed. Right? Attention is the binding of whatever is within its window, all those dispersed qualities bound into the recognition of an object, person, a work. To pay attention is to select a useful unit of experience and to bind its qualities, while also defining its difference from other units and their qualities. Quality, again, defined cognitively according to those systems that the brain uses to process different kinds of stimuli. Attention is the glue that binds these qualities together. Versions of this problem arise for the Gestalt psychologists as early as the end of the 19th century, who saw the problem of part and whole as so basic to cognition. Likewise, the phenomenologists who theorize the ways in which the senses are integrated in act of perception in order to hold together an object seen from different perspectives, right? Why is this one object, even as I rotate it, and it looks so different? Attention has a role in both projects, Gestalt psychology, phenomenology, as the condition of such syntheses. Attention is what makes such syntheses possible. It's usually conceived, as with Treisman's window, in spatial terms. And I'm going to continue to touch on some of the ways in which cognitive science has gone at these problems, but I want to consider attention today primarily in terms of time, not space. What is it that allows us to recognize that an object is the same across time, in spite of the ordinary variance in its appearance? More demandingly, how do we recognize that an object has changed, even though it remains the same object? How are its past and present available to us at once? And a still more demanding question, when we recognize that something is like something else, something we once saw, something that's someplace else, or just related to it by resemblance or analogy or figuration, does that involve attention to two things at once, the things that are like? And what does that mean anyway, two things? What does that mean anyway, at once? So, in pursuing this question, I'm going to let Stephen's Vocalissimus suggest a few examples from painting, from music, and finally from poetry again. And my first is likely to be familiar to students of European art history, Giorgione's La Tempesta. And there it is. Because a painting does not change in time and presents a single front to the viewer, there's always been a temptation to say that we see it all at once. But as we all know, contemporary techniques for tracking the eye's movement have made vivid how attention traverses a painting. It's not so much that we see the whole thing simultaneously as that the order of the attention to its details is under our control. It's variable, subject to the will of the viewer. So here, you'll probably recognize this, courtesy immediately of Sasha Archibald in Cabinet Magazine. We see a famous map of the eye's motion across a Russian realist painting of a soldier's homecoming. First, as a kind of general reconnaissance, the eye wandering freely, taking it in. And then the second instance, when the viewer is asked to judge the ages of the figures in the painting, you can see how attention gravitates to the faces in an effort to answer that question about age. Giorgione, as a painter 450 years before the emergence of that technology, manipulates the transit of attention, or the movement of the eye as it's tracked by such methods, and its inevitable practical lag. Take, for example, the chronic puzzle with this painting of the relation between those two principal figures, the nursing mother on the right and the young man insouciant, or maybe just slightly ill at ease, on the left, leaning on his spear. We saccade back and forth between them, trying to understand the connection. Who is he? Could he be the father, an illicit admirer? Is he even a vision of her child in his future maturity? And all of these explanations, I think, are desynchronizations of a kind. That is, in a sense, every time I look at space in the course of this talk, I want to think about time and difference in time. These explanations are desynchronizations of a kind, two people not quite meeting, not quite in the same place at the same time, some halt or some span opening up between them, a gap that rhymes with the eye's traveling time. The same synchronization problem is still more explicit in the painting's other axis as the picture plane recedes. Everything is calm in the foreground. In the distance roils the tempest that gives the painting its name. And if we move our attention vertically up and down the surface, we take account of that distance, which is anxious, I think, intense, given that the mother is so vulnerable and a storm is coming. The flash of lightning is already with us. What about the rain and the wind? Are they coming? So, the relation between represented distance and distance on the painted plane is an active problem for Giorgione, and that relation is being worked out in terms of time, in terms of sequence and simultaneity. And the painting both taxes and troubles our desire, our dream of seeing it all at once. And here, I think, is the limit of the eye and its transit as a proxy for the attentional problems that I want to raise. For as a matter of attention, how could we recognize these distances, these dissonances, without, in some sense, experiencing the estranged elements together, all together, the transit time of our optical focus notwithstanding, without experiencing them all at once? And again, what would that mean? Let's take another exemplary estrangement within this picture's frame, the two trees left and right. Above the mother, the nursing mother, the foliage seems full and deep green. Above the young man and slightly further back, the leaves are, some of them brown, like those tossed trees deep in the background, where it's almost autumn, perhaps, even a different season. And then in that tree on the left, and really it's two trees, there's a hole as though it's been injured or breached. The juxtaposition has the feel of allegory, a clue to the relation of the people below. But how does this comparison between the two trees work as a matter of attention? Do we see the two trees in a kind of oscillation at the speed of ocular transit or even faster? Or are they in some sense superimposed in the mind's eye, the sense impression and the working memory, the afterimage, on top of each other? They do ask to be seen together, to be seen at once, in order for us to interpret them. Their simultaneity is the cue or the prompt to interpretation. And that simultaneity is what makes interpretation impossible. That is, to begin to answer the question of what they mean, we have to somehow have them both in mind at once. The painting is full of such provocative rhymes, such provocative doublings, opening up gaps in represented time just where it also demands a simultaneous cognition of its unsynchronized elements. And again, to register that lag or that difference, do we not have to somehow know both at once? And then it's almost a joke in the painting, I think. There's its sound, right? The clap of thunder is always lagging behind the lightning, except it's not, or at least how could we think it without already hearing it? So what we're listening to now is a setting of To the Roaring Wind by a composer named Matt Barber, recorded by the McCormick Percussion Group in 2014. The character of attention, I think, if you're paying it, is different now. First of all, the music can be heard all at once, or at least however many the parts, they can all arrive in the ear at the same instant. The mandatory segregations of space, where you can only have one thing at a time, they don't apply here. Listen for a moment. Reflect on how your attention functions in this openness. You might try to identify the instruments. It's a little like trying to move your attention around that painting. You will likely have the experience of parts becoming salient, present, and parts receding, going away, and of greater or lesser sense of their integration, their totality. You might imagine yourself as a conductor rehearsing this group, having to identify in the total texture of the work particular errors, particular mistakes. It is a kind of binding problem, again, how to hold the music together and still be alert to its many parts, alert and ready to separate a part out for focus or for question. It seems to be not so much a problem of divided attention, that is, of attention divided among the instruments, however many there are, but rather a holistic experience of the music, having it all at once and hearing it as one, but with a kind of attention that is as prompt to unbind as to bind. That said, this kind of synchronic attention to any given moment of polyphony is not the best analogy to the experience of looking at a painting. For just as important as the binding and unbinding of parts at any given moment is how the music holds together over time. The listener's ability to recognize, for example, a theme and its variations, or refrain, or smaller motifs and patterns as they may be repeated or transformed from bar to bar. If you listen closely to Barker, you'll hear how particular figures move from instrument to instrument in what is, to be sure, a looser structure of expectation than a Mozart quartet, but still one that allows for some anticipation and recognition. All music is hugely redundant, constantly referring to itself, as though its linear progress were perpetually folded back in a polydimensional origami of self-recollection. I threw that in for the simultaneous translation as just a degree of difficulty, challenge, polydimensional origami of self-recollection. Which is to say, one more time, that we hear it simultaneously if we are paying attention. And with painting, the same questions arise about the mechanisms of this juxtaposition, or at least the best analogy, mechanisms or analogy. Are they somehow superimposed, working memory and present experience as a palimpsest? Do we flicker between them? It's another binding problem, how moments are held together that were originally separated in time. You might say that the more the music echoes or evokes itself, then the more it is simultaneous with itself. Imagine a spectrum. And here we're really moving as well in the territory that Sal has opened for us. At one end, a purely redundant sine wave, invariantly self-similar, effectively a single moment, however long it lasts. And at the other, mere unpredictable noise, which just spills out miscellaneously into time as time passes. Somewhere in between them is music, which accumulates even as it slips by, right? Music which goes past, but in its self-similarity piles up on top of itself, those moments that are cognate, that are recognizably like, that ask to be thought together. And our attention is what does that collation, what makes the serial simultaneous. Now, I'll say again, at the heart of these speculations is the idea that attention brings or binds serial elements into simultaneity. I've proposed a few mechanisms, or perhaps better analogies, by which that might work, especially visual juxtapositions, or a kind of flickering that's not quite simultaneity, but close. Other basic modes of relation might be proposed: figure and ground, signal and noise, reference or even pointing, or trope, metonymy, synecdoche, metaphor, or other kinds of figurative self-presence. Is that what sort of two voices in one piece of music mean to one another, or two similar moments? Are they figures of one another? I'm not ready to choose among them. All I ask for now is that all of these, as names for attention, have the property of loading the present with more than one object. Now, one more example, and once more into the wind. Another poem by Wallace Stevens, The Search for Sound Free from Motion. All afternoon, the gramophone parled the West Indian weather. The zebra leaves, the sea, and it all spoke together. The many-stanzed sea, the leaves, and it spoke all together. But you used the word, yourself, its honor. All afternoon, the gramophone, the world as word, parled the West Indian hurricane. The world lives as you live, speaks as you speak, a creature that repeats its vital words, yet balances the syllable of a syllable. So if it was that S that compelled attention into the roaring wind, in the search for sound free of motion, it's a proper syllable that arrests us, vowel and consonant that makes itself most heard above all other sounds in the poem, a syllable that is some variation of yun or on or on or un. Sound, motion, afternoon, gramophone, honor, and the spiraling together of the storm and the gramophone in gramophone, which has that English word typhoon in it. Storm. Sound is already piling up, pulling the poem together with itself. Let me resist that swoon just long enough to sketch the moment of the whole movement, of the whole poem from end to end. It begins, right, with listening to the gramophone. It's a beautiful line. Feel how your mouth sort of closes around it, how it moves forward in the mouth. All afternoon, the gramophone. It's a focusing line. Stevens has a lot of control over these things. The gramophone is a kind of dialect weather report, whether we're there in the Indies or whether these are the associations of memory that are gathered together, leaves and sea, gathered together and speaking together, so that the talk and what the talk is about are already blurred, speaker and spoken equally speaking. And that's the more true when we come to the many-stanzed sea, as though it had as many stanzas as it does waves. But then the poem introduces a distinction, right, amidst all this coming together, especially sound coming together. A you who used the word. And now language is an instrument, a tool, right, something that you hold out in front of you, rather than a climate. Yourself, its honor. The self is dignified by its tools, standing apart from the world that it works on. And yet, even as Stevens does that, even as his argument sets up the separateness of the you and what it uses, hear that assonance, you and used, falling together. And there's that on in honor, tending towards its fellow syllables, even as it argues for partition. The next stanza, all afternoon the gramophone, rhyme and repetition. As though the record were skipping now, as though its affinity were at risk of converging on identity. And then the record gets on track again, but only to say the word is the world, that language is climate after all, a truth that can be spoken by the hurricane itself, a roaring wind with a full voice. The final stanza then feels Stevens sort of tacking back and forth here. This is a poem so much of lunge and retreat. I know we heard about attention earlier, or so I was told, as a kind of reaching forward. I think this poem reaches forward and pulls back. The final stanza makes an analogy, an as, and that seems to acknowledge the still unpersuaded separateness of the you. It seems to argue for, rather than just assume, that the world is a creature like you, voicing vital words. Taken all together, the poem then is a kind of debate back and forth between the assimilating hurricane and the distinguishing grammar of self and other. The whole poem has something of what we might call Stevens' meridianism about it. Meridianism on the analogy of Orientalism, is a poem from the 40s, American poem. And his poetics often takes its bearings from his imaginary relation between a clear and distinct north and a human and amalgamating south. But it's all worked out just as much in terms of sound, the sound of on and un, which is to say also the sound of one, on which so many of the poem's syllables converge. And these coincidences form a kind of chorus as the passing lines are taken up by an active attention that recognizes in their serial grammar, that is the way it makes sense by going from word to word and not going back, recognizes in their serial grammar a supervening all-at-onceness. And attention is what brings those elements together. The synthetic present is the occasion for interpretation. It's the occasion for the kind of critical work that I'm doing now, laying out an argument step by step, more or less, in language that would itself little reward the kind of listening that I'm trying to give to Stevens. But in listening to Stevens himself, in listening to the poem itself, language is tending in the opposite direction, towards rhyme, towards repetition, towards nonsense, so that this self-simultaneous artifact becomes a babbling or a parling syllabary of only one syllable, and that only one syllable is the syllable one. Prose wants to keep us moving from cause to effect. It's like, I gather, one of those trains that keeps on going that Yale talked to you about, that I heard about. Prose wants to keep us moving from cause to effect, and it can count on syntax's help in doing so. It keeps its words separate, and it does its best to ignore their distracting sonic affinities, has no interest in doubling back. Whereas poetry is the kind of language that wants to happen all at once, to undo the consequence, following on of syntax in favor of a simultaneity that in its density, its complete density, carries sense, meaning-making, back to sense, experience. This is the binding problem, but it's taken in the opposite direction. Not how do we hold the world together, but once we're paying attention, aesthetic attention, how do we hold any part of it apart? The syllable of a syllable on which this poem ends is a part of a part, a specification of a specification, but its specificity is the diamond point of the gramophone needle. And if so, then it is a needle that sings not by tracing the grooves, but by standing exactly still, playing a single synoptic point on the record that rhymes with everything else, sound without motion, and all at once. That's the gist of it. I'll just add a brief coda. Throughout my remarks, I've moved between a relatively detached account of a cognitive problem and a sympathetic analogical reverie, and it is my ambition to sort out the relationship between those two. Maybe I'll have your help. But I want at all events to leave you with this idea that a poem, and perhaps a work of art generally, makes its claim on aesthetic attention by provoking a kind of cognitive rearrangement that defies the seriality, the one after anotherness, of the viewer's gaze and the record's grooves and of the very order of words. Something of art's ability to take us out of ordinary time depends on this experience, folding us back against the sequence of moments. Aesthetic attention is exactly this experience, analogical and unsubordinating and simultaneous. So many convincing accounts, and I think we've both heard them, or I gather we've heard them this last few days and also heard them argued against, but some very convincing accounts of attention link it always to action, as though it were the necessary condition of action or were action itself. Attention is galvanized in the act. This is an argument in a different direction, as though there might be an attention perhaps cultivated in relation to action for us in some evolutionary history, but now being used in this peculiarly action-defying, self-accumulating, self-simultaneous form. It's a way of rewriting, in some sense, that Kantian idea of aesthesis as purposefulness without a purpose, something like attention without action. At all events, I think this, I'll say finally, this also gives us a strong sense of the importance of criticism, which is what many people have been up to here in various ways, although it's been, I think, a healthy mix of art and criticism. But I think this gives us a sense of the importance of criticism, because art's so understood. Art will be hard-pressed to join in the grammar of decision and the grammar of action, the stepwise business of deliberating and then doing, that is arguably the grammar of good politics. Which is to say that while art may engage politics or occasion politics, it cannot by itself as art, on this account, be political, at least not in the sense of modeling what to do. Art and the attention it makes tend away from action. It can be utopian, but it cannot tell us how to get to utopia. In so doing, however, in so being, the attention it occasions is a powerful, maybe a uniquely powerful incitement to criticism, to the activity of sequential reasoning, of explanation, the sort of thinking that can be put to the stepwise, rational work of making a world that makes a place for that art, and that can, from time to time, convene us there and convene us all at once. Thank you.